right, you may be seated, and youth are dismissed up to the youth house.
Once upon a time, there was an important, busy man. He regularly worked 12-hour days, and he brought work home with him in the evenings. He liked the 40-hour work week so much, he often did it twice a week. Even though he didn't have time, he thought an MBA would add to his career, and so he picked up night classes. He listened to business books on his phone in the car, and he'd speed it up so he could get through them twice as fast. His wife tried to slow him down and remind him that he had a family. He was vaguely aware that he had kids, and he was missing their growing up years. They would ask him to be there for games and school activities, but he was always too busy, so they finally stopped complaining. They knew their dad would never change. "I'll spend time with him when things settle down," he told himself. Although he was a smart guy, he never seemed to notice that things never settled down. "Besides, I'm doing it all for them," he told himself when he was feeling guilty. Of course, this wasn't even partly true. He was always, even though they were pleading with him to hang out with them, he didn't do it. But because they lived in the house, ate the food, wore the clothes, played with the toys, he provided. He said, "I'm doing it all for them." His wife nagged him about going to church. He would have gone, but Sunday was the only day he could sleep in. Besides, he didn't see much value in it. He lived in the real world where money is how you keep score. Besides, he told himself, "I'll have plenty of time for God after I make my millions and retire." He didn't take good care of his body. He had a club membership, but he never worked out. His doctor told him he had some serious things going on: elevated blood pressure, high cholesterol. Told him he had to cut back on the Twinkies and red meat and start working out in the gym. So he quit going to his doctor. He said, "Well, I can deal with that kind of stuff when I retire." One day, the CEO of his company came in and said, "We have an opportunity to buy out our chief competitor. I'll need you to travel to China and India and Indonesia to check out their operations." That night, he told his wife, "I know I'll be gone a lot the next few months, but this is huge. When we buy them out, we'll have a corner on the market. We'll be set for life. I can finally cut back, and we can go on every vacation you've ever dreamed about." Well, she'd heard this sort of talk many times before. At 11 p.m., she went up to her room for bed by herself, as usual. As this business tycoon sat at his computer plotting his future, there was only one microscopic detail that had missed his attention. The artery that once had been as supple as a blade of grass now was as dry as plaster and stiff as cement. The blood could barely squeeze through. Every day, well, this man forged deals, sent out emails, pushed his staff, and examined his investments. A few more chips of lipids joined the plaque block. Every steak, every gourmet restaurant meal, every curse at another idiot on the road, every top of his lungs scream at one of his kids was adding to the problem. For 50 years, his heart had been pumping 100,000 beats every 24 hours. Now it skipped a beat, then another, and then a third. He gasped for air and clutched his chest. Even though he was in charge of hundreds of employees and thousands of employees on multiple continents obeyed his every command. But a few ounces of recalcitrant muscle brought him to his knees. His wife woke at 2 a.m. he was still not in bed. So she went downstairs to drag him to bed. She saw him sitting in front of his computer, his head on the desk. She thought, what a child. He'd rather fall asleep in front of the screen than come up to bed with me. So she touched him on the shoulder to wake him, but he didn't respond, and his shoulder felt alarmingly cold. She felt like throwing up when she dialed 911. The paramedics came, and they said he's had a massive heart attack. He's been dead for some time. His death was big news in the business community, and people wrote complimentary articles about him in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes magazine. Then came the memorial service. Because he was so well known in the business community, hundreds and hundreds of people showed up. People began to eulogize him. He was one of the most successful businessmen in America, said one. He was a leading innovator in the field of technology, said another. He was an incredible risk taker, offered another. He was one of the most visionary entrepreneurs of our day, said still another. Someone made a large memorial stone for him. On it they wrote words of eulogy: successful, visionary, innovator, entrepreneur. They put up the man's memorial stone, buried him, and went home. Later that night, when no one was around, an angel sent by God worked his way through the tombstones until they came to his marble column. There the angel traced the one word God suggested for this busy, successful businessman: the word fool. God said, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded of you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" You probably recognize this is a version of a story first told by Jesus. Jesus was blunt in his diagnosis. He doesn't say the man was evil. He says he was a fool. Why does Jesus use such a harsh word? This man didn't set out to ignore his wife or abandon his kids. He didn't defiantly reject God. He just focused on the wrong things. When Jesus told the story, he summed it up with a cryptic one-liner so no one would miss the point. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich toward God. The object of life is not to become rich, but to become rich toward God. It's easy to get confused about our purpose in life. I took 4 weeks study leave in July, and we had some wonderful, fun things we did. But when the days we were home, I was catching up on work projects in the house, the yard, and car repairs. Practically every day we had workmen at our house. It's easy for me to become consumed with things. Do you struggle with this? Do you spend your time thinking about money and getting more and buying more? We all do to some extent, but we don't want to be materialistic. All of us are against materialism. In a recent survey, 89% of Americans said the United States is too materialistic. But in the same study, they found almost the exact same percentage say, "I want more." So we're against materialism. We just want more. If the object of life is not to become rich, but to become rich toward God, how can we do that? Some of the best of what is written about money and contentment is written by the Apostle Paul in his letter to Timothy. So if you have your Bible, turn to 1 Timothy chapter 6. If you want to use our Bibles under the seats, it's on page 1195. So I find in 1 Timothy 6 5 ways to become rich toward God. First, recognize that God owns everything. This is so important. Write this down. God owns everything. Throughout Paul's life, throughout this letter, he's been talking to Timothy about how to deal with false teachers who are focusing on silly controversies that stir up quarrels. He says about them, who think that godliness is a means to financial gain. He says, Timothy, don't fall for this teaching that coming to know God is going to make you wealthy. Now, it's true. It can be demonstrated worldwide that people who give their lives to Christ and follow biblical principles tend to raise their standard of living. But getting rich cannot be our motive for coming to Christ. Paul goes on, but godliness with contentment is great gain. The goal is not to be rich, but to learn to be content. The goal is to become not rich, but rich toward God. Picture 229 people entering eternity after a plane crash. On the plane was a multi-billionaire CEO, a famous movie star, a well-known politician, and a young person returning from an overseas missions trip. After the crash, they stand before God utterly stripped of American Express cards, credit lines, image clothes, and Marriott reservations. Here is the executive, movie star, politician, and young Christian all on level ground with nothing except what they have in their heart. Don't spend your life trying to get rich. Paul says, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. This is proof that God owns everything and you don't own anything. You can't take anything out of the world. That means you just manage it for 50, 70, or 90 years. Maybe you're not a follower of Christ, and you think, well, it's my money. I earned it. I can spend it however I want. I'm the king of my finances, and I'll do what I want with it. No, God owns it all. You just manage it during your stay on earth. This is why making a practice of giving generously to God's kingdom work is so important. It reminds us that we don't own anything. We're managing it for God. If you want to become rich toward God, memorize this verse and say it to yourself. Say this with me. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. Second, learn to be content with the simple necessities. Paul adds a second way to become rich toward God. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. We're to learn to be content with the simple necessities of life. In his final instructions to believers, the writer of Hebrews says much the same thing. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. God says, steer clear of the love of money. Only God can meet your deepest needs. Know that He will never leave you or forsake you. Every once in a while, I think, if I won the lottery, I would do this and that. Or I think, if I had $100,000, I could do this and this. Do you ever think this way? Am I the only one that thinks like this? It's proof that I'm not content with what I have, but I want more. For proof that acquiring more will not satisfy, we only have to look in the Old Testament at King Solomon. Solomon threw such lavish parties that one day's food supply for the palace included 30 head of cattle. One day. I'm pretty sure one head of cattle would provide plenty of beef for our Kincaid family of 4 for a whole year. He had 30 head of cattle a day, 100 sheep, 500 bushels of flour and meal, deer, gazelles, and exotic poultry. He surrounded himself with beauty, gardens, parks, vineyards, houses. He constructed a palace so magnificent that it took 150,000 workers 13 years to complete. It was a really nice house. He liked music, so he collected all the best musicians in Israel and the finest singers to serenade him at mealtimes. He accumulated 1,000 wives and concubines. This is at a time when having more than one wife was common. He had 1,000 wives. I have my hands full with one wife. He had 1,000. I mean, he had to be out of his mind. How can we learn to be content with simple necessities? Saying the phrase, "it could be worse," might help. You can try this today. When you get out of here and go out to your car, you might be tempted to think, if I had a nicer, newer, more expensive car, I would be happier. Like the one parked next to mine. Instead, you get into your car and you say, "it could be worse." Try that. It could be worse. When you get home, you might be tempted to think, "I'd be happier if I had a nicer, newer, more expensive house." Instead, you walk in the door and you say, "it could be worse if you're married." You might be tempted to think, if I just had a nicer, newer mate, I'd be happier. You could do that tomorrow morning when you wake up. It could be worse. Might want to keep that to yourself. You can learn to be content by reminding yourself that you have it better than 95% of the people in the world. Content Christians realize that the quality of their lives does not depend on someday I'les. When I get a better paying job, someday I'll be happy. Or when I get a nicer house, someday I'll be happy. Or someday when I'm married or single again, I'll be happy. Someday when I join the perfect church, then I'll grow. Third, realize that the pursuit of wealth can be destructive. So here's what Paul says. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Notice the downward spiral. If we want to get rich, we fall into temptation, then we make foolish decisions that lead to ruin. 4, famous line, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Notice, money is not the problem. Money is amoral. It's neither good nor bad. It's the love. It's our attitude toward money. Paul adds, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. One of the reasons wealth can be destructive is because it causes us to become proud. We don't have to rely on God because we have our money. We're taught in our culture that wealth brings happiness, but it's not true. There's a shockingly low correlation between wealth and happiness. One of the most fascinating is a study of 22 winners of major lotteries. Dr. Ronnie Janoff Bowman compared 22 winners of lotteries with 22 just normal people, and also with 29 people that recently faced paralysis. They found that over time, the lottery winners returned to their pre-lottery winning levels of happiness. And they lost much of their ability to enjoy the small joys of life. The paralysis victims, this might surprise you, were not nearly as unhappy as might be expected. Once they got over the shock of their misfortune, they were able to experience joy from little things more than the lottery winners. And though it's hard to imagine, they were more optimistic about their future than the lottery winners. I've seen this a little bit in the bit of traveling I've done. I remember when I went to Kenya, they have very little, most of the people, yet they were singing, smiling, exuding joy. Compare that with many Americans who are so unhappy, wealthy Americans who are unhappy. Fourth, set your hope on God and eternity, not on wealth. We're both looking for meaning and satisfaction in our lives. Where do we find it? Our culture tells us we find it by making more money and buying more things. Talk show Dennis Prager wrote about an ad he saw in Los Angeles for a sex therapist. If you're not completely satisfied with your sex life, give us a call. The more he thought about it, he thought about how brilliant this ad is because of two words, completely satisfied. I mean, none of us is completely satisfied with anything. I mean, think about the ad. If you're not completely satisfied with your mate, give us a call. If you're not completely satisfied with your children, give us a call. If you're not completely satisfied with your house, give us a call. If you're not completely satisfied with your church, give us a call. Why does nothing completely satisfy us on earth? It's because God is the only one who can completely satisfy. We have to center our lives around Him. So the Apostle Paul says, but you, man of God, flee from all this. From what? From the love of money. And pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. Fight the good fight of faith. Take hold of the eternal life to which you were called when you made your good confession in the presence of many witnesses. We are to flee from the pursuit of riches, instead become rich toward God. Finally, use your wealth for good. So here's what Paul says. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasures for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. One of the ways to become rich toward God is by sharing your wealth. Why has God blessed us so we've become the richest nation on the earth? Is it so we can hoard it all for ourselves? Maybe God blessed us so that we could share generously. Paul tells us to use our affluence for good. Once we're liberated from thinking that I own my money, my possessions, but that God owns it, and we focus on becoming rich toward God rather than rich, we focus on God and eternity rather than things, our money will flow freely to multiply the ministries of Christ. The rich are not told to take a vow of poverty, but to take a vow of generosity. They're to be quick to part with their assets for kingdom causes. And in doing so, they'll lay up treasures in heaven. One reason people don't give is because they think, I'm not rich. I don't have anything to give. Religious pollster George Barna has found that 1 out of 3 Christians who attend church at least once a month or more don't give to the church. 4 out of 10 Christians who attend church at least once a month don't give anything to the church or any religious organization. A USA Today poll asked people to finish the line, I'd give more, but 79% said they had no excess income to give. You say, yeah, that's me. By the time I pay the mortgage, the utilities, I buy food, pay for gas. You seen the price of gas lately? And I still have student loans. By the time I do all that, I don't have anything left to give. We may think that's true, but doubtful it's true. Truth is, every one of us is rich by global standards. Statistically, if you have sufficient food, decent clothes, a house or apartment that keeps out the weather, and a reliable means of transportation, you're among the 15% of the world's most wealthy. If you have any money saved, you have a hobby that requires some stuff like fishing or hunting or water skiing or golf, whatever, astronomy, whatever it is. You have a variety of clothes in the closet and 2 cars of any kind, and you own your own house, you're among the 5% most wealthy in the world. So when Paul says to the rich that we're to share, he's not talking to them, but to us. Now, it's possible to break free from materialism. I'll help you. So get your wallet. All right, guys, reach in your pockets. Come on. Get your wallet. Come on, Mark, let's go. Ladies, dive in those purses. Come on, you got to find it. It's in there. Get your wallet out. Everybody hold it up in the air once you got it. Come on. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Okay, so now let's open it up, see if anybody's home. Yeah, okay, got a little bit. Now, to break free from materialism, hold it up. Come on. I want you to pass it to the person sitting behind you or in front of you. Come on, let's do some trades. There we go. Give it back to somebody else. All right, Maya, come on. We're going to do the offering. Let's go. I want you all now to give as generously as you've ever wanted to do in your life. Just dump it all out in the offering. You can caress it if you want. All right, you can hand it back. Just playing with you. If you're not giving anything to God, why don't you start today? If you're not giving to the level of your income, why don't you increase it, your percentage today? God says that the standard should be 10% of all that you earn, you give back to Him. Why? To remind you that you don't own anything. God owns it all. That you're just a manager. I think it's important to think in terms of percentages. So if you figure, okay, I'm giving 1%, how about bump it to 2%? If you're giving 4%, how about bump it to 5%? The object of life is not to become rich, but to become rich toward God. Is it possible that you've fallen into the trap of thinking too much about things and what money can buy? Things are only temporary. All that lasts are God and people. When we stand before Christ someday, our 401ks and investments will be irrelevant. Our GPAs and SAT scores will not matter. No one will care what clothes hung in our closet or what cars sat in our garages. The only thing that will matter would be, are you rich toward God? If you're in high school and you're thinking, when I get accepted into college, then I'll be happy. Or if you're a young person, you're thinking, when I get my first real job and get some cash flow, then I'll be happy. If you're thinking, when I retire, then I'll be happy. Forget it. You're dreaming. What if there is no satisfaction with things? What if the only satisfaction in life comes from being rich toward God? What are you doing to become rich toward God?